Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My presentation today will be entering the realm of environmental psychology. In particular, I'll be looking at how we can shift human perception to increase forms of pro-environmental behaviour, and looking at what role the psychedelic experience may hold in this. To begin with, I'll give you a brief history of psychedelic research and the significance of this study. I'll then talk about the methodology I have used and the two bodies of literature I've chosen to focus on. One, the psychedelic experience and feelings of nature connectedness, and then two, feelings of nature connectedness and how this relates to pro-environmental behaviour. I'll then talk about my research question, the limitations to my study, and some of my main findings. I'll finish things off with the application of how I'm going to use these findings, some future avenues of research, and some conclusive statements to finish off. Now, psychedelic research takes us back to November the 16th, 1938, to a man named Albert Hofmann. Hofmann, a Swiss chemist working at Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, discovered the compound lysergic acid dithalamide, commonly known as LSD. Now, Hofmann quickly concluded that LSD would be perfect in therapeutic usage and started sending doses of LSD and another psychedelic, psilocybin, to clinics and universities all across the world. In 1947, the earliest psychiatric experimentations of LSD took place at Boston Psychopathic Hospital, and in 1953, the first clinic using LSD in established therapy was constructed at Powick Hospital in England. At the same time in England, a man named Humphrey Osmond was pioneering the use of LSD to treat alcoholism. In 1957, he coined the term psychedelic, and by the end of the 60s, he had treated over 2,000 patients for alcoholism. In 1960, Hofmann had sent LSD and the psilocybin to a young, charismatic psychologist professor at Harvard University called Timothy Leary. Now, once psychedelics got to Harvard University, research erupted, which was very much intrinsic to the genesis of social movements that soon spread quickly across the world. These include the anti-Vietnam War movement, the women's rights movement, the student movement, the environmental movement, and the gay rights movement. I don't have time to cover why, but in 1966, LSD and many other psychedelic substances were made illegal across most parts of the world. Now, there was a stale period of maybe around 10 to 15 years, but organisations such as the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies are leading the resurgence of psychedelic research alongside many other universities and bodies. Now, this is a graph looking at the number of scientific articles published about psilocybin, the active component found in magic mushrooms, and you can actually see the flow of psychedelic research. Psilocybin is a great reference point to look at how this flow has changed through time. There's a huge boom around the 60s, there's a significant drop, and then once again, from the years around 2010 to 2016, to what's going on right now, there's another significant boom in psychedelic research. So what is the significance of this study? Why am I doing it? Well, firstly, psychedelic substances are frequently used by hundreds of indigenous cultures in various spiritual and healing practices. And they've been used for if not hundreds, if not thousands of years. Daniel Pinchback, author and activist, says we're in an ecological mega-crisis. One of the greatest tools we may have to slow down this crisis may be the psychedelics. Now, insight into the psychology that affects pro-environmental behaviour must be considered. Any research that is looking at this also must be considered. So, for this study in particular, I wanted to understand how something that isn't studied that much may actually be the key to solving one of the greatest issues we have, or we have ever had, across this whole planet. Now, I've got a quote here from Walsh, 1984. He says, "I believe that the real starting point toward healing the social and environmental crises begins with self-confrontation and self-examination." I think the psychedelic experience may offer us that. So, how did I go about my research task? When I was looking at the psychedelic experience and how it related to pro-environmental behaviour, I kept on coming across the term nature connectedness. Now, nature connectedness is an individual's experiential sense of connection to the natural world. So what I chose to do was break up my thought model into two bodies of literature. One, the impact the psychedelic experience has on feelings of nature connectedness, and two, the impact the feeling of nature connectedness has on one's pro-environmental behaviour. So, firstly, the psychedelic impact on feelings of nature connectedness. So, in a study by cahart-harris in 2014, participants on the psychedelic compound psilocybin showed an increased brain connectivity and a decreased connectivity in the default mode network. Now, the default mode network is an area of the brain associated with fixed perspectives of reality that are strengthened over time through continuous exposure to repetitive stimuli. So his study found that under the compound psilocybin, the connectivity of the entire brain increased, yet the strength of the default mode network significantly decreased. And this significant decrease of this fixed, rigid perspective of reality was correlated to subjective feelings of nature connectedness. Now, all patients that went under the treatment of psilocybin all made reference to feeling a great sense of connection to the natural world. In 2017, cahart-harris et al. Did another study with psilocybin helping to treat depression. Now, of the 17 participants who claimed the treatment was still effective 6 months later, all said that nature connectedness was a central contributing factor to their treatment. Now, Wolfson in 2011 also says that psychedelics offer psychology one of the best methods to quickly transform our consciousness. They promote feelings of nature connectedness and heighten our empathy towards other beings. And Pank, back in 1966, describes that the LSD experience is responsible for cosmic unification, nature connectedness, and long-lasting positive changes in attitudes and behaviour. I mean, there's significant research showing that the psychedelic experience leads to feelings of nature connectedness. And this is not a correlation, this is a direct causality, as you can see, because as soon as the experiment is occurring, straight after is then the described nature connectedness feeling. It rules out any chance of a reverse causality. So the second body of literature, so if you have this new sense or new connection to nature, does this lead to pro-environmental behaviour? So Robert Hoot and Harris Friedman in 2011 got 210 participants and completed a host of interconnectedness measures. Results show that a sense of nature connectedness and a consideration of future consequences predicted self-reported pro-environmental behaviour and beliefs. In a similar study conducted by Pierre and Foster in 2007, 76 participants conducted an online study measuring connected to nature, egotistical values, biospheric values, and pro-environmental behaviour. Now, results show that connection to nature was positively correlated to pro-environmental behaviour. And in a similar study, once again, a greater sense of nature connectedness in the self predicted higher levels of pro-environmental behaviour. And of course, in another study, a situation stimulation experiment conducted by Zheng et al. Also did a similar study, and they found that connectedness to nature positively correlated to pro-environmental behaviour. Now, this is quite self-explanatory. You'd think that if you felt more connection to nature, you'd want to engage in more pro-environmental behaviours, but it's important to show you the research, otherwise you're just making assumptions. Okay, so what I had at this point was that there is a link between the psychedelic experience and feeling connected to nature. And there also is a link to feeling connected to nature and then engaging in pro-environmental behaviour. But these are two separate bodies of literature. So what I wanted to look at was, is there a direct link between the psychedelic experience and pro-environmental behaviour? So my appropriate research question was, what role does psychedelics play in increasing pro-environmental behaviours? And the next body of literature I was going to look at targets this area. So the question is, how much literature is there that links psychedelic experience to pro-environmental behaviour? Answer, there's one paper, and this paper was released just a few weeks ago in early August 2017, early September 2017. Now, Matthias Forsman and Christina Sagilo conducted a study including 1,468 participants, and they looked at how people had experience with psychedelic substances and how this related to their pro-environmental actions in day-to-day life. They asked a number of different questions and situational simulation questions to allow them to gather enough data to generate scores of nature connectedness and scores of pro-environmental behaviour. Now they did find that the psychedelic experience does lead to feelings of pro-environment. Psychedelic experience does lead to pro-environmental behaviour, and it is through this sense of feeling more connected to the natural world. Now this is the only paper that's been published, so it's quite astonishing that the research that has been published for the last 50, 60 years is actually showing a correlation to this first study that was just released a few months ago. I find it amazing. So the limitations to my study, what were they? There was plenty. So for literature 1 and 2, literature review 1 and 2, the subjective terminology nature connectedness was used. Now, there was different, depending on which experiment and which literature I was looking at, different measures and scales were used to conduct this nature connectedness term. For example, in the first body of literature with the psychedelic experiences, nature connectedness was not a constructed value using a scale, it was just a subjective feeling which they made a comment on when they were, after they had the experience, such as I felt an incredible sense of connection to the natural world. Whereas the other body of literature was talking about the nature connectedness in terms of a scale. So you've got some differences there. You can't assume that the subjective feelings were similar in each individual. There's variation between participants. Now, the experiments, because there's such a small pool of literature available, the experiments that have been conducted often include different dosages, and they often include different substances, so it's hard to do a comparative study. And I was also analysing both scientific studies and academic literature, so the variations in validity may affect some of my findings. Some limitations to literature review 3, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. There's only one scientific study that's been conducted that directly links psychedelics to pro-environmental behaviour. This because it's an extremely new pool of literature, so it's hard to generate. It's just an extremely new pool of literature. This study also had a lack of quantitative data. It had qualitative data saying yes, this leads to pro-environmental behaviour, but what people want to know is, well, how much is this affecting pro-environmental behaviour? Is this increasing the sustainability of the household? Is this decreasing an individual's water usage or carbon footprint? This is things that need to be looked at. And the experiment itself from Forsman and Sagigler, the pro-environmental behaviour was self-reported, so that's always, that needs to be considered when making any bold claims. And there was only, like I said, there was only qualitative data recorded. So some future avenues to explore. So Scientific investigations in the future should focus on retrieving data from the impact a psychedelic experience has on engaging in pro-environmental behaviour. You know, how long do the effects last? Is it days, weeks, months, or years? Do you get a variation of results depending on dosage or frequency of consumption? And what types of pro-environmental behaviour? And I think it's extremely important, this final point, that we have to understand quantifiably the impact it has. Is it reducing carbon footprint, or water usage reduction, energy savings? I think future research should also consider looking around the legislation around psychedelic substances, just so it's an easier access for scientists to conduct these studies. So the applications of these findings, so short term, basically what I've wanted to do is just increase public awareness and try and reduce the taboo and naivety around the topic of psychedelics. And also these short-term findings may help fund greater, more advanced studies in the psychedelic community. Long-term, I think it's too early to postulate without fully understanding the impacts that research is having right now. Yes, we are in an incredibly tough environmental situation, and yes, psychedelic substances have shown to have phenomenal effects on the individual and phenomenal effects on their impact, on their life, to engage in these pro-environmental behaviours, but it's way too early to make any bold claims that the psychedelics are the answer. Much more science is needed. So in conclusion, there's valid research showing that psychedelics do lead to feelings of nature connectedness. And there's also valid research showing that nature connectedness leads to pro-environmental behaviour. However, there's not enough research available to say that psychedelics directly influence pro-environmental behaviour. However, the first experiments backed up by Matthias Forsman and Christina Sagivalo back up the theorised nature connectedness model, that the psychedelic experience leads to nature connectedness, which leads to pro-environmental behaviour. Without this study, it would be extremely difficult to come to a conclusion. And lastly, this is an incredibly exciting new area of research to explore, with the potential to hold some fascinating discoveries, some which we need now more than ever. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions?